well, welcome. One of our favorite guests, somebody who is helping our little area from afar, outside of Milford. What can you say? We've gotten such good results from somebody who started just in the near term now.
Yeah. So great to be with you, Al. Thank
Why
you.
don't we start with an introduction if there's somebody who doesn't know you?
Joe Kennedy, your congressman for the 4th District of Massachusetts, 34 cities and towns, pretty much south and west of Boston, down to Fall River and including Milford.
Now, how many years?
So starting my 3rd term now, been in for about 6 months out of this 3rd term, so it's 4.5 years roughly.
I was going to say, it doesn't seem like it was that far back, but it's almost 5 years now.
Yeah. Time flies. And no, look, I mean, I remember I'm bouncing around Milford on my first campaign, stopping in Oliva's and going door to door with Representative Fernandez and Senator Moore, both of whom now have moved on to other things. So it does go quickly, but it's been a wonderful couple of years for me to get to know and the Milford community and try to dedicate myself and our office here to the issues and concerns of the constituents around Milford. And then to be able to come down and talk about issues with you. So thanks.
And now a new daddy.
That's right. So we've got a little girl who's Ellie, who's about 18 months old, and we're expecting a little boy in December. So,
Okay, time to get cable TV. Boy and a girl, you're going to have an ally.
Yes, we are, thankfully. Little boy in December. So very, very excited. I wish I could say we're getting our sleep now, but as you can probably remember, there's still not a whole lot of it. But we're thrilled, and Lauren, my wife, is doing well. Ellie hasn't quite picked up on something yet, but she will soon. And we're, I think, like with most 18-year-olds, working on that whole sharing thing. So, or 18-month-old.
18-month-old.
Working on that whole sharing thing. So we'll see.
Well, my grandson is 22 months, and he's decided sharing is for others. That others should share with him.
That's a good idea. That's right.
Yeah, we're trying to explain to him that that's not quite the concept. Speaking of sharing, what's going on in Washington? Is it getting any better?
Look, Al, it's a tough time in Washington at the moment. There's no doubt about that. I think regardless of whatever side you're on, or whatever side of the aisle you're on. As we've talked about before, some of my closest friends in Washington are Republicans. They're decent folks. They're good folks. They're doing what they think is the right thing for their district. And look, there's different political philosophies in this country. That's fine. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. The tone and the rhetoric and the kind of political dynamic that we find ourselves in at the moment is particularly difficult. The fights on the big issues, immigration, healthcare, tax reform, are real. The rhetoric that we're seeing, in my mind, particularly coming out of this administration, is real. There are, however, down a level, a number of bills that are and initiatives that are moving that don't make the headlines, which is also where we try to spend an awful lot of my time and focus. I got a bill passed out of the House unanimously on Donald Trump's first day in office. We got a bill out of our committee about a month or so ago, unanimously, led by two staunch conservatives, folks that I don't often agree with, but Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee and Dr. Michael Burgess from Texas, who without their help we wouldn't have gotten across the finish line out of that committee. We're looking forward to having it on the floor shortly, which creates an over-the-counter category for hearing aids. As you might know, hearing aids they can be roughly $2,500 for one or $5,000 for a pair, and there's literally tens of millions of seniors that go without them every year because they're not covered by Medicare.
And children. Yeah. My grandson had hearing, and we have to get the little hearing aid, and it's like they grow out of them so quick.
So this would provide an over-the-counter category for them for mild and moderate hearing loss, so not severe. But and there's a couple of hiccups there we tried to massage through to make sure that we satiated some of the legitimate concerns that folks had. But again, through some real leadership from those conservative House members, we were able to bridge that divide and got it passed out of our committee unanimously. Interestingly enough, getting back to that polarization piece, so I was the lead Democrat on the bill out of the House. Senator Elizabeth Warren is a lead Democrat out of the Senate, and she's been the one pushing this hard now, trying to make sure that this reform can get through. Those two conservatives, Dr. Burgess and Ms. Blackburn, were attacked by a conservative organization that took out ads against them in their own districts for working with Senator Warren on that bill, which is difficult to stomach.
Nostalgia. Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. You know, can we put pictures of them up in the chamber and say, guys, it can work?
And it can. And what's interesting on this is you do have members, even, as I said, conservative members like Dr. Burgess and Ms. Blackburn that are going to fight for their beliefs as staunchly as I will or as staunchly as Senator Warren will, but where those overlap are going to be engaged and be more than willing partners. And again, that bill wouldn't have made it through our committee unanimously but for their help. So there's members there that understand that Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan dynamic and are willing to commit themselves to it. It is unfortunate that when you do, you all of a sudden have these outside organizations that then target you for actually doing your job. And that's a shame.
I remember 4 years ago when you came on and said, you have to sometimes compromise for things that people in the square states need. Have nothing to do with Massachusetts. But then you get them to compromise on things we need.
That's how it's supposed to work. So
I mean, it's scary because, you know, we talked about the Supreme Court. This time I was disappointed in the blue people, just like last time, you know, I was disappointed in the red people. You know, sitting there saying, now wait a minute. When I hear we will not approve anybody you send, what scares me is, how do you work together? Aren't you telling whoever has the 51 votes, go swing as far as you can to either extreme?
I think the concern at the moment is, yes, and look, that last Supreme Court nominee was a little bit different because of Senator McConnell's decision to lower the bar for confirmation for Supreme Court justices from 60
The
to
nuclear
51,
option.
the nuclear option, which he invoked. And look, we can go, plenty of folks can go back and go tit for tat about Democrats did this and Republicans did this, and so Democrats did this and then Republicans did this, and all of those things are going to be true, and they also don't really matter at a certain point. At a certain point, you need folks that will be willing to say, this has to stop. What is actually necessary, I think, it's a bit wonkish here, but in these times of particular stress on our across our communities, across our society, across our democracy, where you're seeing an awful lot of people that are angry and upset because your system of government isn't working the way we want it to, it's finding ways to strengthen those institutions, not tear them down. Because the more they get torn down, the more they get pulled apart to those poles. And the more you satisfy one, the more you anger the other. And then that thing swings back and forth. And all that means is that one side or another just gets angrier and angrier without saying, you know what, I understand the fact that you've got some concerns and anger and that you're upset, whether I find that legitimate or not. I recognize the fact that if we are really actually going to get through this challenging time that we're in, I got to be willing to suffer, to swallow some of these things that I don't like, but you've got to too. If we can get to that point, can you suck it up and move forward? And that means putting some of those slights and insults and aggravations behind you. And look, I think that's something that we all could do better at, and we all need to do better at.
Well, I mean, I'm seeing it because if you mention the word Warren in a conservative group, I mean, it's the reaction the same as you mention the word Trump in a very liberal group. And it's like, why?
And look, I've known Senator Warren now for years, not just as a colleague, and I'm in the House, she's in the Senate. But as you might recall, I actually met my wife in our class as I was her student when she was a law school professor. That law school class, you had 80 or so students from across the country, different states, different nations in there. I would be willing to bet almost anything that every single student in that class would have said she's one of the best teachers they've ever had. Doesn't matter about political beliefs, doesn't matter about ideology, just when it came to her dedication to her students, her dedication to teaching, how she threw herself at the material, and look, took it on her saying, my job is to try to explain, yes, some aspects of either contracts law or bankruptcy can be complex and difficult to understand and challenging, but my job is to actually help people try to learn it. And she dedicated herself to that. And it's what earned her not just award after award for being the best teacher, but an extraordinary amount of gratitude from our students from saying, really showing an interest in our students and not just research or writing or something else. And so I've gotten to know her, the person, and her family, and her dog, and everything else over the course of the past several years. I have extraordinary affinity for her. And again, I think one of these challenges that you see across politics today is you look at these folks that you either will get a snippet of off of television or off of YouTube or off of social media, and recognizing that that clip that you see you might love or you might not love. But it's a clip, and you get these folks that are essentially dehumanized to an extent where you look at a social media feed, most folks would never say those things to somebody if they were sitting across the table from you, right?
Well, I think that's why the negative ads do work
Oh, yeah.
on candidates you don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, when local elections come,
Mm-hmm.
and I've called out a candidate there was some PAC ad, and I said, are you responsible for this fecal matter that was put in my mailbox? I know these people.
Yeah.
You know, when you mention a John,
Yeah.
you know, anybody that's local, these are not demons.
No.
I may disagree with them.
Yeah.
Over the years, we've never agreed always, but he's a good person. His heart's in the right place.
Yeah.
So when you see negative ads, now in Elizabeth Warren, that you don't know, somehow I think, I mean, it would really annoys me when I see people outside of Massachusetts coming in and telling me how to vote.
As it should. And look, when it comes to aspects of federal law, what the laws that I advocate for and the reforms that I advocate for, yes, they're going to affect somebody in Arizona and Michigan and California too. And so while I understand that folks have a right, because the laws and policies that I am trying to push will impact them. And so I understand the fact that comes with criticism that you're gonna get from other folks. Understanding as well that if you do take a step back, just as you said, you never expect to agree on every
Everything.
issue with anybody else, even your best friend, even sometimes particularly your spouse. And that's fine. And you know, some things you've thought through really well, and you might know some of those issues better than I do, and I might have thought through some other ones more than you have, and I might have a particular area of expertise, and I know some aspect of it better than you might. And that's fine. Nobody can be an expert on anything. The only thing I ask of my representatives, Senator Markey, Senator Warren, our president, President Trump, vice president, is understanding I'm not going to agree with all of them on everything, but I expect they're going to do their homework. I expect they're going to exercise good judgment. I expect that whether I disagree with them or not on those major pieces of policy, they're going to explain their logic and reasoning and be willing to engage in that debate so that they can be held accountable, either through earning my support or listen to my voice to say, I don't think you thought that through the right way.
But listen to what you said. My president, our president.
Yeah.
That goes a long way in my mind, because whether you agreed or not, you know, whether you're an Obama supporter or not, the day he became president, boy, I wanted him to succeed.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with Trump. I do not want him to fail, because that means not good things for the country.
No. And so I have, as you well know, I've got serious policy disagreements with this administration and what their definition of success is. I have huge concerns, and I fought very hard against some of the reforms that they're calling for, particularly in healthcare, because it's going to devastate aspects
You
of our
called him out
community.
on mental health care.
Yeah.
What's that about?
So on mental health, and then on Medicaid funding, so two of their big proposals around healthcare. Also, our mental health system across this country already it's not really a system. It's a series of stopgaps that don't do anything to meet the need that we are seeing across our country. To a large extent, I think many experts would agree, the safety net that we have in our mental health system ends up being our criminal justice system.
I was going to say, they go to jail.
They go to jail. And look, I saw that as a prosecutor, working in our state courts here in Massachusetts, in Middlesex County, and on the Cape and Islands, where you would have folks that are suffering from alcoholism, substance abuse disorder, opioids, or just diagnosed mental health disorders as well, where they might be committing criminal activity. Whether or not they technically committed a crime is actually up for debate, but they get arrested and brought in and dropped off on our plate to say, okay, you deal with it. And you say, well, this person's sick. I can't.
Putting them in a criminal environment isn't going to
Not going
help
to solve
them.
the problem. And look, you talk to some of our sheriffs here, and they will recommend the same thing. They'll say, look, if you've got somebody struggling with an opioid epidemic, an opioid abuse, if you're locking them up for 3 months and not addressing an underlying concern around addiction services, they're going to come back out and they're still going to be an addict. And if they're breaking into homes or cars to try to get money to substantiate that, or to satisfy those urges and the withdrawals to buy, whether it's more heroin or prescription drugs, unless you address that, they're going to reoffend. And then that means next time, instead of getting 3 months, they're getting 6. Instead of 6 months, they're getting a year. Instead of a year, they're getting 2 years. Instead of 2 years, they're getting 5. And now all of a sudden, you have folks that are in jail for an awfully long period of time because you're sick. And the criminal justice system doesn't have the supports necessary to actually help them get better. You've got some, but you don't have the array of services that we
Wasn't
actually
that the
need.
whole premise of setting up the safety net for psychiatric care?
We never funded it.
Well, I'm saying, but that was the idea.
That was the idea, but we've never funded it. State and federal government has never funded it. And the laws behind it to actually flesh that out, we never funded. I mean, we have, if you could think about it, how if you had a physical health care, or a physical health issue, what we have in certain circumstances today is if you were suffering from a mental behavioral health issue, people would say, okay, well, that's fine. One, you can't see a doctor because there's an awful lot of doctors don't take insurance. Those that do take insurance sometimes won't take public insurance, so Medicaid. 3, those that do, they might say, okay, we'll take it, but there's a 2 or 3 month long waiting list. Or they'll say, we'll see folks on emergency services, but we won't see folks for that routine maintenance,
That
right?
you
if
need
will.
to really deal with it.
Well, so what that means is you've got stage 1 cancer. I know you're sick, but you're not sick enough yet. Come back when you got stage 3 and we'll try to treat you. Well,
Kind of too late?
you would never do that with somebody with cancer because you recognize the fact that we don't want to actually let you get sicker. We want to address this as early and detect it as quickly as we can and intervene as early as we can. That's not the system we have set up in our mental health care. And so while there is strong bipartisan support, recognizing particularly in the midst of a nationwide opioid epidemic, that our mental health system needs to be strengthened and needs to have these investments. There's a major disconnect between some of my Republican colleagues and I on this because the largest payer of mental health services in the country, you know what it is? Medicaid. President Trump has, through his health care plan, Trump Care, has proposed to cut Medicaid by $800 billion. With his budget, he has cut it by another $600 billion. It's a $1.4 trillion cut over 10 years to Medicaid. At the same time that you've got a massive opioid epidemic that is touching
Everybody.
families all over this country. You can't square one with the other. And so I spent the day-to-day, first off down in Taunton at the community counseling of Bristol County, listening to, meeting with their executive team, understanding, getting a better idea of some of their services and the complex sources of funding and how we can try to look at healthcare delivery reform and look at some of the changes there to try to get better outcomes that are measurable, particularly with regards to mental and behavioral health, so we can know where the early investments need to go. And then for the last 45 minutes or hour or so, listening to some of their patients tell their stories about the challenges that they've gone through and how, what that has meant for them and their families, and whether it's been access for treatment for their kids, for their extended family members, for themselves, the strength that they have shown to pick themselves up and try to get care. And the story that ran through all of it, the connective thread, is people that are screaming out for help, saying, I know I'm sick, I want to get help, I want to get clean, I want to get better. And a society that's just saying, we don't have space for you. We don't have room for you.
So what do you do to fix it?
You scream from the rooftops. And you try to make sure that, and particularly with regards to mental health, recognize that this is one, it impacts far more people across our society than people think. About 20% of the population has a mental health issue. 2, because of the stigma associated with it, most people don't speak up about it. Loved ones don't speak up about it. You don't hear people, no one thinks it's your fault if you get cancer. There isn't the same willingness to engage in that conversation around mental behavioral health issues. You don't hear people talk about it quite as openly. Three, people that are struggling with mental behavioral health issues often struggle to advocate for themselves because they are dealing with a mental or behavioral health issue.
But as a society, there was a lady in a family we know that started a program called Special Olympics.
Yep.
And you think about how far that's come.
Yep.
The self-esteem, we were just at the swim meet, the state swim meet, the pride these kids take.
Yeah.
And some of them are 20-some years old, they're
Yeah.
men and women. Our society seems to have come so far on one little concept.
We have, but also recognize that one of the great recipients of one of the ways that many Special Olympics athletes and those suffering with developmental differences across this country get the funding that they need is through Medicaid as well. And that's getting gutted. One of the ways that local school districts get funding for equipment for special needs children is Medicaid.
Medicaid.
So when you're starting to talk about an $800 billion or, combined with the budget, a $1.4 trillion gut to Medicaid, these are the programs that are going to get cut. And then you say to a school district, well, if you believe that our public education system should guarantee that every single kid in this country gets access to an education, and you say, okay, well, everybody should, and if you've got somebody that has special needs, it doesn't mean that we don't educate that child. No one thinks that. It does mean that you say, okay, well, how can we make this work? And for some school districts, perhaps like Milford, we say, okay, well, the cost of some of these kids is so much, you can't expect this local school district to bear that full brunt because they happen to be expensive. So for some of those programs, the federal government can come in behind and provide some of that additional support. Not under this bill.
Yeah, because I mean, years ago, we changed the school budgeting process where we expect the administration to stay within our 2-point-something% on everything but SPED and ELL, because they have no control. You have a child comes in, costs us 150 grand versus 10,000 for a typical kid. They can't control it. 2 or 3 of those kids could blow their budget. So to protect the typical kids programs, we have to treat that totally separate. But they're our kids. How do you not fund those things?
You fund them and you find a way. And that's a promise that I think we as a society make to everybody to say, we'll find a way. Understanding that that burden is then going to be shared across our society so that it's not all just going to be on the backs of Milford necessarily to find, because.
But it is, though, if you give a block grant, I get a kick out of this block grant idea. Because all I do is I say that's more that we have to cover as a town.
Yeah.
Because
exactly
you're
right.
giving it to the state's going to come up with their unfunded mandates to the town, and we're still going to have our population that are Milford residents that we're going to find a way of taking care of.
So you're 100% right. There's a popular conception out there about, talked about by some of our Republican colleagues, about block granting Medicaid over this other idea of per capita caps, which is both of them are ways that say the federal government's going to limit the amount of money we spend on a Medicaid
The federal
program.
government's going to push it down to the local towns.
So yes, that's exactly what it means, is that the federal government says, hey, this is how much you need, or this is how much we're going to spend, the rest of it's on the state. The state then says, okay, well, this is how much we're going to spend, and then you either cut services or you put it back on
And then you got
towns.
people like my daughter coming saying, for me to run the Best Buddies program, I'm already begging, borrowing, and stealing everything I can. You're going to cut me more?
Yep.
And we have to
exactly
say no, and we have to find a way in Milford to fund that.
So-
But some towns can't.
But so, Al, this is where there is a philosophical difference on health care across the parties. Republicans traditionally or typically saying federal government's ability to do this effectively is limited. Push this down to the states to make these decisions, allow some flexibility, and they'll find efficiencies there. And they might be able to find some efficiencies, but if you cut that funding back dramatically, you can't find enough efficiencies to make it all work, right? 2, the whole point about particularly a Medicaid program is, imagine if the federal government, if in times like we're having at the moment that are relatively good for our Commonwealth, imagine if we go through another recession like we did 10 years ago, 8 years ago.
And we will.
And we will. But if the federal government basically is saying, hey, we're only going to give you this same amount of money, and then the state says, okay, well, now there's hundreds of thousands of other people that are now out of a job and need health care, they either destroy their own budget or they have to raise taxes in the middle of a recession, which
Double
is not a
whammy.
good idea. or that gets passed down onto a town where they have to do the same thing. So you've got Republicans that are saying the federal government role should be limited, push this down to the states, and see if they can come up with efficiencies and savings, which for most of us, that when you look at those numbers, mean you're going to cut services. Or you look at it from the way I look at it and say, look, there are folks across our society that have needs that we as a society say they still should be met. That kid needs special education, should still be educated. I can't tell you exactly how much it's going to be next year in Milford, because somebody might move in, somebody might move out. Some of those costs might be higher. But if you get everybody in, you can defray those costs across a much broader population, so that instead of Milford bearing the brunt of it, maybe it's the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or maybe it's the entire country, in which case everybody's paying a little bit more, but with the assurance that if it was your kid too, they could get the services they need too.
I mean,
and
let's
so
face
you
it.
spread out that risk.
You're hoping you never, just like me as a grandparent, hope I never have to use Special Olympics programs, Best Buddies programs. You just pray you don't. But it's like the fire department. I hope I never use the fire department. Doesn't mean I'm not going to fund it.
And that when they're, and look, for those of us that have participated in Special Olympics programs and Best Buddies programs, to see the impact that those programs have on those athletes, on those communities, on those families, it's
Yes.
extraordinary, right?
Now, help me understand. I hear that we're going to cut funding to Planned Parenthood. I didn't know we funded Planned Parenthood.
So the federal government does provide some funding to Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood, as I think you know, provides a whole comprehensive array of services to its patients, and particularly low-income women.
Right.
What the federal government does not fund at all are abortion services.
Yeah, the A word that you can't use.
Yes, abortion. So, and that's barred from something called the Hyde Amendment. So federal government dollars do not go to fund
But I
abortion.
thought Planned Parenthood is they helped these women who, mainly women who don't have a choice, just bill back through Medicare.
So
Or Medicaid.
Medicaid pays a huge portion of those services, but they also, so they've got different funding streams. A lot of it is through Medicaid, and again, they provide a whole comprehensive set of services that does not include abortion. Some of those clinics provide abortion services as well.
But I'm not paying for those.
No, you're not.
Okay.
You're not. Regardless, some Republican colleagues have said over and over and over again that they want to defund Planned Parenthood because money is fungible, and so if you're providing government funding for some services, well, that's Planned Parenthood could take that money and fund something else and use that money for abortion, which I've pointed out to them, and I pointed out to them in a hearing when we had this a little while ago. If you think about that, Al, for a second, it's not just Planned Parenthood that provides abortion services all over this country. A lot of hospitals do too. And many of those hospitals accept Medicare and Medicaid. So if your concern really is that you want to cut all government funding to any institution that actually provides abortion services, that's fine. But then you also have to go out and ask your constituents why you are now okay with shutting down thousands of regional hospitals, rural hospitals, and major hospital centers all over this country.
And IVF clinics.
Yeah, I mean, all sorts
I mean,
of stuff.
by definition, I hear fertilized embryo is a life. Well, all the IVF clinics I know take 32 eggs, fertilize them, and do cohorts of 8. Okay, so if the first one takes, and you thaw the rest of the, it's over my head to understand.
So it's not, look, these are, I understand they're passionate beliefs on both sides of the aisle here. They're deeply held. How I try to approach that issue is understanding the sensitivity to it, understanding the emotion around it, but then try to make sure that we have an intellectually honest and consistent debate. And what I engage in these conversations frequently with some of my conservative colleagues that look at this as on a strictly religious ground and that are very consistent on it. I'm not going to convince them to go differently, and they're not going to convince me, and that's fine, and we can have that debate. And I respect it. But the part that drives me nuts is when you have folks that then try to use this for something else that it's not.
When you try and mix science and politics.
Yes, and that's the problem.
And and I look and I say, okay, my colleagues have said, Obamacare bad. Do away with Planned Parenthood in parts of this country, you got no other care except Obamacare. So what do?
You don't, and that's the challenge. Is what you've heard some of them say is, well, you can take the money that you're using to fund Planned Parenthood clinics and fund community health centers instead. Community health centers are extraordinary services. They're all over the country. They get broad bipartisan support. We need to support them more. We need to flush out those services. They need greater investment. They are already overly subscribed. They don't have additional capacity. You can't make up for the loss of care for some of these Planned Parenthood clinics by just saying, we'll take that money and put it someplace else.
Well, it's like repeal and replace. I don't understand the concept. Replace with something better and repeal, yes. But like you say, we could put the money towards something else. But if the something else isn't there, Joe, we could go on forever. But I know that in 8 minutes, I was told you have a conference call to continue the good fight.
We're trying.
So thank you for everything you do. We always enjoy having you here.
Grateful. Thanks for being with.
And as always, get to know the people who represent you. I've always said I'll never ask you to vote for anybody, but I'll beg you to vote. And the more you get to know people, the better you feel on how they're representing us. So thank you. To our 6 loyal viewers, thanks for joining us. Good night. May God bless, and may tomorrow be a better night than tonight. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.